Hello, everybody, and welcome to our conference, the Cape Breton Highlanders and the Shaping of Canada, Conference on Military and Social History. Let me be the first to welcome you. I'm Lachlan Mcginnis. I'm a history professor here at Cape Breton University, and I would like to introduce you to our president, who will be giving our welcoming remarks. David Dingwall is the 7th President and Vice Chancellor of Cape Breton University. And prior to taking his role here at the university, he has held a distinguished public policy career, as well as extensive corporate governance experience. He has also had a prominent legal career, been and continues to be a corporate director, a distinguished public speaker, visiting lecturer, and author of the book, Negotiating So Everybody Wins. He has also been an extraordinary mentor to many Cape Bretoners and Canadians from coast to coast to coast, helping them to establish their own careers and to make a mark across our country. President Dingwall is a member of the Queen's Privy Council and is also, importantly for today, an honorary colonel in the Cape Breton Highlanders. Now, under his direction, Cape Breton University has actually achieved many significant milestones, including launching of the new strategic plan, the new academic plan, the new research plan, as well as an updated and inclusive executive committee, new CBU branding, as well as unprecedented enrollment growth, which I've seen since I've been here, as well as a revitalized campus with plans for future growth and further development. He has also been, I know he's been very busy and leading CBU through the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're all very happy to be gathered here today. So welcome, President Dingwall.
Good morning. It's delighted that you've been able to join with us today and tomorrow as well. Last night we all celebrated a national holiday in honor of our Indigenous citizens. And on Wednesday evening we had at the campus, some of you were in attendance, some of you were not, the tour of valor. We drank copious amounts of wine. I see this table here and this table over here. But it was a delightful evening, and I think it was so delightful that the university may consider doing this on an annual basis. And we may have to up the price a bit in order to look after that one today. On behalf of the Board of Governors, the faculty and staff of Cape Breton University, I would like to welcome you all, conference delegates, and presenters, and those joining virtually as well. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge that we are all gathered here today on Treaty Day. Yesterday was a national holiday, but today is also Treaty Day. Cape Breton University has a 40-year relationship with the Indigenous community, and we are very, very proud of that. I would also like to acknowledge and to thank our core organizers for this conference. Ryan Ferguson of the Atlantic Memorial Park, Ian McIntyre of the Cape Breton Highlanders Association. Thank you, gentlemen, very much. As well, I would like to acknowledge the exceptional work and leadership of Dr. Lachlan McKinnon. Where is he? Thank you so much. This conference is an important part of the Cape Breton Highlanders' 150th anniversary celebrations. You only get one shot at 150 years of celebration. And we hope that with today's events, tomorrow, as well as with the Tour of Valor, it will be remembered for many years to come. Over the next 2 days, you will delve into the conference themes: the history of the Cape Breton Highlander unit. Secondly, the importance of the military to Canadian identity and nationhood. Thirdly, individual experiences of warfare in Canada, including Black and Indigenous voices. Finally, considering issues of commemoration and memorialization of Canada's war effort. These discussions and scholarly examinations are so very, very important. The sharing of ideas, research, and knowledge of the past and the shaping of Canada will ensure that this history lives on in perpetuity and can continue to be passed down through generations to come. My friends, the president of St. Mary's University, a dear friend and a great advocate for Canada's military in Halifax, wrote me the following note, and I'd like to share it with you. On behalf of St. Mary's University, I kindly ask that you convey our most sincere congratulations to the Cape Breton Highlanders on their 150th anniversary. We commend the distinguished service of the Cape Breton Highlanders, not only in armed conflicts, but in the service to all Nova Scotians as a militia. As we honor you for your service, we thank you for all that you do. Signed, Dr. Robert Summerby Murray, President and Vice Chancellor of St. Mary's University. I'm so glad that attending our special convocation is part of our conference agenda, honoring our friends. The first time in the history of the university, we will be honoring Ian McIntyre, John Clark, Michael Alteen, Joseph Burke. 4 distinguished members of the Cape Breton Highlanders is a very special part of these 150th celebrations. Again, my friends, thank you for coming. Thank you for your time being spent here at Cape Breton University. Enjoy this conference, and I hope to see you later in the day. I'm going to have to depart fairly soon for another event, but I will be back for the special convocation at 11 a.m. So if you see me sneaking out the door, it's not because I'm not interested. It's because I have other duties that I must attend to. Thank you all, and welcome.
Thank you very much, President Dingwall. So now we're going to begin with our first session, which explores Cape Breton's military history, the Highland unit, and the island at war. In the first session, we have 4 speakers. We're going to be welcoming Dr. Brian Tennyson, Mitch Javelin, Sarah Mcginnis, and Ken Donovan. So first I'll say a few words to our presenters. When you're giving your lecture, I'll keep time as the chair of the session, and I'll just make a note with my hand at the back, 5 minutes, 2 minutes, and then wrap it up. I'll give you a few extra minutes if necessary, but that's how I'll go about doing the timekeeping for the session. But without further ado, I would like to welcome our first speaker kicking off the conference, Brian Tennyson. Dr. Tennyson is a graduate of the University of Toronto and the University of London, where he received his PhD. He has taught in the Department of History here at Cape Breton University for many years, rising to the rank of professor, and since 2003, emeritus professor. He has also lectured at universities in England, Scotland, the United States, as well as South Africa. His broad field of study is imperial history, with a focus on Canada's involvement in the First World War. But he's also written extensively on Nova Scotia and Cape Breton history. He has published 16 books, among which are Guardians of the Gulf, Sydney, Cape Breton, and the Atlantic Wars, Percy Wilmot, Cape Breton at War, Mary Hell, the 25th Nova Scotia Battalion, the Canadian experience of the Great War, Canada's Great War, how Canada helped save the British Empire, and many others. He has also won the Atlantic Book Award, and his biography of Sir William Hearst, who was the Premier of Ontario during the First World War, is currently out with the publisher. So a very prolific writer and a great historian of the Canadian war effort. So welcome, Brian Tennyson.
It occurred to me that if we're celebrating and commemorating the Cape Breton Highlanders, one of us, and I didn't know what other people were doing, of course, but I thought one of us should talk directly about some aspect of the Cape Breton Highlanders. So I decided I would talk just a little bit about the 185th Battalion. Most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with it, but almost nothing has been written about it. It gets mentioned here and there, but I thought, well, I'll just give you a little capsule history of it. Well, not even that, really. I just want to talk about some of it, and my title, as you perhaps know, is The Betrayal of the 185th Battalion. You may know what I'm referring to, and then again, some of you may not. So, it doesn't start in 1914, it starts in 1915, the story, because certainly Cape Bretoners and a lot of other Nova Scotians enlisted in 1914. But it wasn't until 1915 that the 185th Battalion was authorized. Well, actually, it was the 85th first, and then the 85th. Let me try that again. In 1915, Allison Boyd, a very interesting man, kind of an important man, but not a man who's very well known. You'll see the references to him. But he was one of the very few commanding officers of a infantry battalion in Nova Scotia. There were 10. It's 10 battalions raised in Nova Scotia. Out of the 10, I've been looking into all of them, and he was about the only one who was really qualified to command an infantry battalion in 1914, 1915, because he was a professional soldier. He was with the Royal Canadian Regiment. He had a senior position in Military District Number 6 in Halifax. That was very unusual. So he was a significant man who one would expect to play a significant role, and he did, briefly. He was also a cousin of Sir Robert Borden, as you may guess if you didn't know, but I don't know that that really made much difference to anything. In 1915, he was still in Halifax, but he got this brilliant idea. Recruiting had slumped a little bit in Nova Scotia, and perhaps in other places as well, in the spring of 1915, and you may know why. That's when the first division went into action in the famous or infamous Second Battle of Ypres, where they had the dubious distinction of being one of the first units to be subjected to poison gas. An extraordinary thing, of course, was that they held the line, and the troops on either side of them didn't. They more sensibly, actually, fled because there was no protection from poison gas. They'd never seen it before. The Canadians didn't, and they suffered very, very profoundly for it. And that had a bit of an impact back home because Canadians, when you read the press, Canadians were really quite shocked at these horrendous losses in the stories that newspapers produced about what had actually gone on. And you notice a little bit of a slump in recruiting after that. So Allison Morgan got this brilliant idea, not only that he would raise a battalion, but he would raise a Highland battalion. And that made a whole lot of sense because, of course, there's a very strong Scottish influence in Nova Scotia. And it was much stronger then, I would say, than it is now. And people like to go to Cayleys and enjoy Celtic kind of music. But 100 years ago, this province consisted of small communities. It's primarily a rural community. And the city was an industrial place, admittedly, but it was a small place. There was Scottish people in Nova Scotia, like other ethnic groups, were very prominent. A lot of the people in Cape Breton, may find hard to believe, but a lot of people in Cape Breton spoke Gaelic on a daily basis. It wasn't something you studied. They lived in that. We have lots of that. But that's true too, of course, of the Acadians who spoke French in their communities, and a lot of Lunenburgers who spoke German on a daily basis in their community. It was a very different place because you didn't have all the mass communications and travel and all the rest of it, and homogenization through the school systems and everything. So he got the idea. He wasn't a scholar himself, of course, but he got the idea. We raised a Highland, we recruited a Highland battalion. It would probably be a very good response. So he got permission to raise the 85th Battalion, which of course everybody knows about, I'm sure. And he got all the recruits he needed in about 3 weeks, which was pretty impressive. Had more than he needed, in fact. So he then got another brilliant idea. Let's do it again. Why not? Do it again. But he didn't propose to just raise another battalion. He thought, let's raise a brigade. 3 more battalions. Now that's pretty ambitious. That's another 3,000 men, roughly. Could you actually pull that off? Well, he did. And it was an interesting experience because the media got behind him, military people got behind him, the Scottish communities got behind him. There's a lot of militia regiments. There were a number of militia regiments that were Highland units. And so they all belonged on to this. And they raised the whole 3 battalions. One of them, of course, was the 185th. And the way he did that, it seems kind of extraordinary. He really organized a kind of dog and pony show or a traveling circus kind of thing. And they had himself and other good speakers, university presidents and prominent people, clergymen, and all kinds of people who were good speakers and were well known. And they took the pipes with them, and they took the brass band with them, and they toured the province, mainland province, not Cape Breton, but they toured the province, putting on these big shows and recruiting things, and people just flocked to it. And then once they had them all, they had them all trained in Aldershot, and when they got to the end of their training, in the late summer, he organized transport, because people didn't, well, a few people drove cars, but not very many. He organized transportation so people could come to Aldershot and see the presenting of the colors and to see the men marching and doing all their thing before they departed. 10,000 people showed up. 10,000 people. The city of Halifax only had about 50,000 people in it at that time. 10,000 people from all over the province. It was incredible. And then, when they sailed from Halifax, the whole brigade sailed together on one ship. 8,000 people flooded into Halifax. Now, some of them would have been Halifax people, of course, but they came from all over the province because the men came from all over the province. And people realized by this time it's the fall of 1950, and people understood that a lot of these guys weren't going to be coming back, or might not be coming back, or might not be coming back in very good shape. So it was, they flooded into the bottom. The Citadel Hill, was lined with people, the streets, all the way down the docks. The docks were packed, and they were all there to say goodbye and wave them off as the ship sailed out of the harbor. Extraordinary popular enthusiasm. Now that's important. I mention it. That's important, I think, because that was the highlight. It was kind of downhill after that. Because the government had already started changing the recruiting system, so that, well, I shouldn't really say they changed it, but they focused on it more. They kept creating new battalions. And some of you may know, there were 260 infantry battalions recruited in Canada in the course of the First War. 260,000. Really? But they all didn't go to war, of course. They all went to England and were disbanded. And that's what happened to the 185th. They got to England. They weren't disbanded immediately. Other battalions were disbanded, but the 185th, when they heard it was going to be, when the public heard it was going to be disbanded, there was a hell of an uproar. Politicians and the media and influential people and so on. And so they had to come up with a compromise. They came up with a compromise. They broke up the brigade, but they kept 2 of the 4 battalions. The 85th was put into the 4th Division and went to France at the beginning of 1917. 185th stayed in England because they had created a 5th Battalion, which never went anywhere. When it was broken up, because the CEF needed the men, then the 185th was broken up as well. So the 185th, in my view, I like to say it was betrayed. The people in Nova Scotia were betrayed, and in the case of the 185th as well. Which isn't to say that the men in the 185th, well, they were betrayed in a personal way, because they were all from Cape Breton, and it meant a lot, been recruited there. And so the men, of course, were all transferred into other units. Mostly, I haven't surveyed all 1,000 of them, but I surveyed a couple of hundred just to get a sample. And most of them went to the 25th Battalion, and others too into the 85th. And of course, the casualty rates were so much that they just kept feeding them in. So the 185th never actually went to war, which doesn't mean we shouldn't commemorate it, of course, and certainly not that we shouldn't commemorate the men who served, and the 25th and 85th battalions fought. Well, the 85th from Vimy Ridge on, but the 25th was here from the autumn of 1915. So there are an awful lot of men went through those battalions. I'll just mention two of them finally, just because they're significant. The commanding officer of the 185th was a man named Frank Parker Day. Chances are you've never heard of him, but he is well known in some circles. There was no logical reason why he should have been appointed the lieutenant colonel of 185th. He wasn't from Cape Breton. He had no Scottish background. He hadn't actually even lived in Nova Scotia since about 1910. He left to go, well, even before that, he went to Mount Allison to school, and then he left the province, and then he came back to join the war. Anyway, he took a reduction in rank, because he was sitting in England doing nothing. He took a reduction in rank to major, was posted to the 25th, as second in command, and he had some luck then. He had some luck then because the commanding officer of the 25th got killed about a week later in action, which meant that Frank Parker Day finally got to command the battalion, but it was the 25th, not the 185th. Unfortunately for him, he fell ill 3 weeks later. Wasn't wounded, yeah, fell ill with a nasty condition that I won't discuss, and had to be shipped back to England. And this was the summer of 1918. So by the time he had his surgery and recovery and all the rest of it, the war was over. And so his whole war really amounted to about 4 weeks. He went on a very distinguished career in other areas. The other man that I like to mention was Gordon Harrington. I don't know how well known that name is to people nowadays, but Gordon Harrington came from a prominent family in Halifax. His father was a judge. Gordon was a lawyer, and he made the interesting decision as a young man when he graduated to move to Glace Bay. Glace Bay was a good place to move to. It was a thriving place. He became the miners' lawyer for the workers. I was very popular. He became mayor of Glace Bay. He joined the 85th and then became the second ranking major in the 185th. When they got stuck in England, he got plucked out of the battalion by headquarters and was sent to, they created an office in England of overseas military forces. It was almost like a second minister of military defense. He worked there because he was a very intelligent guy, very organized. And he actually rose to the rank of deputy minister in that office. He went on, as some of you may know, to be elected to the legislature, and eventually was premier of Nova Scotia in the 1930s. But they didn't. Neither one of them had what you could really call a war. They got to England, and aside from a very brief respite, but for the other men, most of them, well, the other men, they were all transferred into other units and fought. And so we remember the 185th for what it was and what it meant to people. But of course, it's really the men that we remember the sacrifices they made and the heavy losses. Thanks very much.
Thank you for the wonderful paper, Brian. I neglected to mention this before, but we're going to run through all of the papers, and then we're going to have a question and answer session at the end. So hold your questions, and we'll come to our next presenters, and then we'll come back for a discussion. So next, I'd like to welcome Mitchell Javelin. He's from Bredor, Cape Breton, and he's a 2020 graduate of the Dalhousie University Masters in Library and Information Studies program. He's also a recipient of the 2020 history from Cape Breton University, and he's very passionate about the archival profession, particularly related to history and history of the Canadian military. And indeed, he studies Canadian wartime history. During his studies, Mitchell completed his honors thesis on a First World War soldier from Marguerite named James Arthur Murphy, who I believe he'll be discussing in his presentation today. So welcome, Mitchell.
Click on the, where to go? Close on.
Thank you for the introduction, Lachlan. Hello, everyone. My name is Javelin, and again, I would like to extend a welcome to everyone from away to Cape Breton University and to Cape Breton. Today, I'll be telling you an interesting story of a First World soldier named James Arthur Murphy. This presentation comes from a chapter from my undergraduate honors thesis in history I completed in 2017 under the supervision of Dr. Honorary. During that time, I was also working as an archival intern at the Beaton Institute at Cape Breton University, where in my second semester, I saw a donation of letters come into the archive where there was a fairly complete collection of letters from James Arthur Murphy, who wrote home from the war in Europe. With the Beaton, there existed already a font for James Murphy that consisted of a scrapbook of a variety of materials, including letters, battle plans with handwritten notes, and writings. The donation consisted mainly of many letters of the Murphy family, with the majority of them being from James Murphy writing home from the war overseas. Other letters and records were related to his father's farm business, in addition to letters from other siblings. It was a real mix of doing archival work and research at the same time, which is a real highlight of my 4 years at Cape Breton University. The photo in the background here is a big photo of mine that illustrates the Canadians having marriage. It's a painting by Richard Jack titled "The Taking of the Rich Easter Monday, 1917," from the beautiful collection of work the Canadian War Museum. So just a little overview, some of the points that I really want to for you today. The Murphy family of Marguerite, some points about Murphy's early life, his recruitment into the military, entering the war, Murphy's involvement with trench raiding near Herrington Ridge prior to the big assault in April 1917. A bit more of the story post-war, and a bit of a conclusion to wrap it up. Additionally, I'll be introducing an upcoming project releasing this fall. And the image on the right here is an image of Murphy in his early years before the war as the military college. Murphy's and Marguerite. James Arthur Murphy was born in 1893 to his parents James M. and Julia Murphy, beautiful Northeast Marguerite in Inverness County, Cape Breton. James had 7 siblings: Mary, Peter, Dennis, Martin, Randall, Michael, and Rebecca. His brother Dennis also fought in the war, but tragically died not long before the end of the war in France in 1980. The photo on the right here shows the Murphy family, with James noted being on the far left in 1933. James's early life. Not many details about Murphy's early life are known, but there are a few that we know from a personal memoir that he wrote later in life. James Murphy attended public school in Marguerite until the 10th grade, when the school unfortunately shut down. From his memoir, we reflected on the closing of the school by writing that the schooling that he had received, this is all the training that I had to face the future. At 16 years old, for the next 2 years, Murphy would work in the coal mines like many other men of Cape Breton. Writing on this, he said, there for 2 years, I spent only 50% of my life underground doing the job of a grown man. Later, with the aid of his mother's relatives, who taught at St. Francis Xavier College in Indigenous, Nova Scotia, Dr. J.J. Thompson, the Seattle College's vice president, and Dr. M. Cody, who was a professor, James was able to finish his high school education. Soon after finishing his studies, the war would break out, engulfing Europe in a bloody war that would rage for 4 years. His way to the Royal Military College. For recruitment purposes, the Royal Military College of Canada was authorized to conduct countrywide recruitment at colleges and universities. Recruitment by RMC at these locations was based upon student enrollment. For St. Francis Xavier College, there was one single recruit allowed, and that recruit, James Arthur Murphy. Through his letters, James describes overall his experiences studying and training at RMC was a positive one, and he was well liked by his superiors. In one letter, he describes a time when senior students tried to get him to tell a dirty joke to a couple of Army officers, but he refused and was later reprimanded. He was also crowned a heavyweight boxing champ during his time there. Upon his graduation, Murphy received commission as a lieutenant. In April 1916, he was sent overseas to join the Allies fighting. The photo on the right here is an image of pre-war RMC students. I wish I had a more complete image of Murphy with his peers at RMC, but sadly, I did not. The battalions. During his time in the military, Murphy served in 3 different battalions. He served first with the 59th Battalion, which was authorized in August 1915, and recruited in East Ontario and Hull, Quebec. The 59th only existed for 5 days before being absorbed into the 39th Battalion. The 39th was authorized in July 1915 and recruited in the same area as the 39th. The 39th never saw action in France and was also later absorbed into the 6th Reserve Battalion. After being idle for a time with the 39th, Murphy requested active duty in France. Following this request, he was then placed with the 46th Battalion of Saskatchewan, which was mobilized out of Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. The 46th was also known by another name, the Suicide Battalion. They had a 91.5% casualty rate that saw 3,484 wounded and 1,433 killed.
Excuse us, Mitch, we have to leave at 9:30.
Of course, thank you.
Thank you.
The battalion also includes Victoria Cross Winner Hugh Cairns. The photo in the background is a group of officers and NCOs of 46th Battalion. The song, 1916, is up in the mud. Murphy's letters home. Remarks of the military must censor letters home. Does not disclose any secret information about Allied movements or plans. On this, he writes, we must not tell anything about where we are or what is going on. I say through my own letters, as you will see. Oftentimes, Murphy would simply sign the country name at times, or sometimes somewhere in the mud. Murphy's first real experiences of combat is at the song. September 1916, Murphy was en route as a junior officer of 2nd C Company. 53 days later, he would go as the company commander of C Company and led an attack on German lines on November 3rd, 1916. In a letter, he announced how fewer than 7 minutes, 3 officers were killed. This attests to the brutality of the fighting at the time. Murphy's next move with the 46th would be to move into the lines near Vimy Ridge in the closing months of 1916, while also spending Christmas in the trenches. On a side note, reading Murphy's letters at times became a bit of an emotional experience. Oftentimes, he would find their loving son, Jim. He would also constantly be assuring his parents that he is fine and he is safe. And on one occasion, he tells them he will have some good stories when he comes home. New attack on countries. During the war, Canadian troops began developing strategies for combating German troops. This new tactic was countries. Raiding became something symbolic between major offenses. The goals of trench raiding are to gain familiarity with the land that they are occupying, check and understand any enemy defenses were located, as well as gaining more battle experience. Raids were also often brutal experiences that employed even more brutal tactics. Oftentimes, raids were a way to test enemy morale and gauge how they stand up to a small surprise attack. The first raid was done by the Prince's British Light Infantry at the end of February 1915, prior to the formation of the Canadian Corps. By the end of March 1917, the Canadians conducted only 60 raids, many going directly into German trenches. Raids became a vital source of information gathering that proved very valuable in planning an attack on Henry Ridge. The image on the right is a painting by H.J. Moab entitled A Night Raid that depicts a nighttime raid, as the title suggests. Murphy's story. By the winter of 1917, James Arthur Murphy was an acting company commander in the 46th Battalion. In a letter, Murphy comments on finishing the war at writing, "You see, we want to finish the war before the Yankees come over and do it for us." Soon enough, Murphy and his company were called upon to conduct a trench raid at the lines near Vimy Ridge. Initially, he was planning to be a street raid, but was reconsidered into a brigade-sized raid. During my research, I found a passage in a book written by H.F. Root that included an excerpt from Murphy himself. In February 1917, my colonel called for a raiding party of 50 men and 4 officers. I asked if I could write my own orders, and I did, making up 4 sections of 12 men each. We were not to have any artillery support, a sneak raid. Before this raid came off, the brigadier decided to make it a brigade raid. I had the company from the 46th with 4 officers and 250 men. During the raid, while leading his men, Murphy was injured. He was wounded in his left arm by shrapnel. Remaining focused on the task at hand, Murphy stayed in control and led his men back to their line, following the raid. The raid was a success, but in the aftermath, it had been revealed that there were 150 casualties. For his bravery and exceptional service, Murphy was recommended for the Military Cross. The aftermath. Following his injury, Murphy was removed from combat and officially reported. His parents were informed of the event. Soon after, Murphy wrote home himself with a letter to parents that he was okay and he was being looked after well in the hospital. Murphy would undergo many surgeries in Europe, as well as more once he was home. Murphy stayed in the hospital for months and later was sent home to receive more care. Murphy's time in the war was over. He would go on to do many other things, such as pursue further education, start a business with a friend, travel in the United States where he would find work, and eventually start his own family. That's a story for another time. On the right is an image of the military cross that Murphy received from King George himself. It's a bit of a conclusion. The study of Murphy's story paints yet another angle for the experiences of a Canadian soldier at war, and one which provides context for something that's not often discussed, the raiding of trenches. Murphy's participation in trench raiding in the lines near Vimy Ridge also highlights their importance in the planning for the assault in April that will become a highlight for the Canadian experience in the First World War. But Murphy's story is also the story of another Cape Bretoner at war. So, in addition to talking about Murphy, linking directly to his experiences is a project that was done by the Beaton Institute in 2017. So, the project was done by the Beaton, and the project was funded by Digital Museums Canada. The goal of the project was to highlight Cape Bretoners at war, the First World War. And the project selected 4 individuals: John Roger Dougal, tunneler; Helen Kendall, nursing sister; Anthony Szymanski, a Canadian soldier in the project and as a prisoner of war; and their new friend, James Arthur Murphy. The project was a mixture of different materials such as archival, audio-visual, illustrations, and narrations. The project was also done in a way to use as an educational resource that can be used in schools to teach students. As of now, the project is tentatively set to be released in November 2021. This is just some references from the chapter of my thesis. Thank you from the chapter of my thesis.
Our next paper is going to bring us to an earlier history of Cape Breton and military engagements. I'd like to welcome Sarah Mcginnis, who has been the historian at the Fortress of Luxburg National Historic Site, administered by Parks Canada, and she's been there since 2016. With a background in both public history and archives, her primary roles include supporting the development of visitor experiences, collection of materials, facilitating research opportunities, and increasing public accessibility. Since 2017, Mcginnis has also been actively involved in the University of New Brunswick Bioarchaeology Field School program, undertaking research with Dr. Amy Scott in order to uncover more about the lived experiences of 18th century Luxburg through bioarchaeological evidence. So welcome, Sarah.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much to Lachlan for that introduction. Excuse me. As Lachlan has said, I've spent this last 6 years in my position at the Fortress of Luxburg National Historic Site, talking almost exclusively about Luxburg as it was in the 18th century. But today's discussion has a bit of a different scope. For many, when they think of the fortress, town, and its modern neighbor, they believe they have little in common. But the reality is that they're connected by many threads, and by one key thread, their harbor. Today I'm going to talk to you briefly about Luxburg Harbor, which over the course of the past 3 centuries was witness to more conflict than most within the Atlantic region, and how that has impacted those who have called this place home. Founded on unceded Mi'kmaq territory in 1713, Luxburg became the capital of the French colony of Ile Royale only 4 short years later. From the community's inception, its harbor was its true crown jewel. It served the needs of the community well. It was close to the lucrative Grand Banks fishery and provided ample shorelines for fish processing. And it was large and deep enough to welcome the more than 100 trade ships that visited each year to take part in transshipment and bring essential goods to its residents. It also remained ice-free through the cold, long winter months. Further, it was easy to defend. The harbor has a narrow mouth, as you can see from this map here, and the strategically placed substantial defensive works that were constructed by the French all aimed to defend it from a sea-based attack. For 30 years, the community thrived, and particularly its fisheries. Luxburg's exports of cod equaled at least 12% of France's annual catches, and the value of its exports far outweighed the investment that the Crown was making in the capital town. As shipping increased, French administrators recognized the need for marine services. A lighthouse was erected, the first in what would now be known as Canada, and a careening facility, which was the precursor of a dry dock, essentially, was established in order to conduct maintenance and repairs on vessels that visited Luxburg Harbor. As time went on, the community and its population continued to grow, and so did its status as a military target. Peace would not last forever in this fortified town. The first European war that found its way to Luxburg shore was the War of the Austrian Succession. After war was declared between England and France in 1744, the harbor's role expanded. It became a base for French privateering in the North Atlantic, and within the year, an assault would find New England and British forces at Luxburg's door. Olada Equiano, a man once enslaved who served on the British flagship, recalls joyously how the besiegers' ships entered the harbor after the fortress had fallen. Later writing, "At last, Luxburg was taken, and the English men of war came into the harbor before it, to my very great joy. When the ships were in the harbor, we had the most beautiful procession on the water I ever saw. All the admirals and captains of the men of war, fully dressed and in their barges, well ornamented with pendants, came alongside of the Namur. The vice admiral then went on shore in his barge, followed by the other officers in order of seniority, to take possession, as I suppose, of the town and fort. Sometime after this, the French governor and his lady, and other persons of note, came on board our ship to dine. On this occasion, our ships were dressed with colors of all kinds, from the topgallant masthead to the deck, and this, with the firing of guns, formed a most grand and magnificent spectacle. Even at this time, with the mighty fortress before them, the focus fell on the town's shores, and within months the same harbor that had welcomed Luxburg's residents saw them deported back to France. During the English occupation of 1745 to 1749, interest in the harbor continued. Admiral Peter Warren, the naval officer who had led the British squadron and then acting governor of the town, suggested that a careening yard be developed that would be capable of maintaining and repairing significant ships of the line. This request was taken seriously, and had British control of the harbor continued, it had the potential to become Britain's first naval base in North America. But the community was forfeited to France in 1748, and Luxburg's French occupants returned the following year. The French return to the community in 1749 would be relatively short-lived, however. Unable to resolve the defensive deficiencies from the landward approach, by which they lost the fortress during the previous siege, and knowing that another attack was inevitable due to rising tensions in the region, the community feared the worst when war was declared once again, this time the 7 Years' War. Now, an even larger force found its way to neighboring Gabrus Bay, and yet the French held their ground. Luxburg's garrison attempted to prevent troops from landing, then worked diligently to protect the entrance to the harbor, as they recognized that British ships penetrating that harbor would ensure the community's immediate fall. When the island battery, the key defensive work which prevented enemy ships from entering its precious harbor, was silenced, the French resorted to sinking the majority of their small fleet at the harbor mouth to block the entrance of British ships. They continued fighting, even if it only delayed the inevitable. After Luxburg fell in 1758, British forces were left with a harbor in shambles. It was filled with wrecks caused both by their attacks and in last-ditch efforts by the French to keep British ships at bay. And within a few short years, the Crown decided that the fortress town should be destroyed to prevent a French attempt to reestablish control in the area. By 1768, the garrison departed, and the remaining citizens moved across the harbor to continue the community's legacy of participation in the fisheries. The cannons were quiet, and animals grazed where the fortified community once stood. For more than a century and a half after the fortress's demise, the community of Luxburg continued to grow and develop. And while the fisheries continued to be an essential part of the lives of the residents, the attributes of Luxburg Harbor that had appealed to the French during the 1710s continued to provide modern solutions as well. As coal and steel production increased in Cape Breton's industrial center, the large ice-free harbor became a location which supported year-round exports. Luxburg is, after all, Nova Scotia's only ice-free harbor east of Halifax. To make that possible, the Sydney and Luxburg Railway, or SNL, was founded in 1895, providing a vital link between communities and allowing for significant shipping to take place all year round. The community also maintained a number of the harbor services that the French had put in place during their occupation in the area, including navigational aids and ship repair services. With ready access to fuel, ships increasingly saw Luxburg as a reliable port. Further, Luxburg housed a wireless communication base as well. The community, once a hub for knowledge sharing between France and its colonies, saw the development of the Marconi dedicated receiving station between 1912 and 1913. This station, located fewer than 2 kilometers from where the fortress once stood, allowed for increased correspondence between Canada and its mother country. And it's for these reasons that when war broke out in 1914, Luxburg was again seen as a prime military target, and the community was well aware. On August 1st, 1914, prior to a formal declaration of war, members of the military had already arrived in the community in order to start defensive preparations at the wireless station. Members of the 94th Argyll Highlanders, who would be responsible for mounting guard duty at the station for the duration of its wartime operations, arrived only days later. The community was on high alert, and by August 5th, rumors of nearby German cruisers were already circulating in the town. Throughout the First World War, Luxburg's harbor played an important role in the war effort. The port, with its narrow entry, proved to be a strong staging area, and the SNL provided vital access to steel and coal that were being produced in Cape Breton's industrial core. After the war ended, the community resumed many of its day-to-day activities. But all that would change with the outbreak of the Second World War. With that, Luxburg was put on alert again. Although its wireless station had been decommissioned many years before, the harbor and its amenities continued to make the community a significant target. Within weeks of war being declared, then Mayor Melvin S. Huntington noted in his diary that he was requesting defensive measures to be put in place in order to defend the community, and primarily its harbor. As the war progressed, the port once again became a key area for staging, exports, and the armament and repair of vessels. Luxburg raised its own Cape Breton Highlanders Reserve Battalion, which practiced drill near the government wharf, and new defensive works, known as Fort Wolfe, an homage to the general who'd silenced the island battery, which protected Luxburg's harbor mouth almost 200 years previously, were established to guard the entrance to the port. Anti-torpedo nets were set to provide further protection. And then, with World War II, came threats that hadn't previously existed as well. The town soon started participating in air raid drills, where residents blacked out their homes at the signal of 8 short blasts from the powerhouse whistle. And by August of 1942, an RCAF radar station had been erected outside of the town proper. It was part of a larger network of stations that spanned the eastern seaboard, tasked with keeping the Maritimes, Newfoundland, and Labrador safe from air-based attacks. Manned 24 hours a day, the station's equipment was capable of tracking aircraft within 100 miles of the community. War also started hitting closer to home. The loss of the Ss Caribou, a freight and passenger ferry to Newfoundland, which was torpedoed and then sank, saw that more than 100 lives were lost. The Caribou was a frequent visitor to Luxburg, which acted as its home port in Cape Breton during the months where Sydney's harbor was inaccessible due to ice. So one could see how the loss in relatively nearby waters would shake the community in a different way. In both World Wars, the members of the military stationed at Luxburg were welcomed into the community. They played hockey with residents, attended dances, and got to know citizens throughout their service. And Luxburg offered them significant support. Except in one story of young women being warned by their parish priest to stay away from the boys in blue. There's just a really wonderful spirit of community and acceptance that develops throughout this time. Even though no battles were fought there during the First and Second World War, as there had been in the 18th century, the townspeople supported each other in similar ways. In the time since VE Day, Luxburg has continued to see change in and around its harbor. The bleeding whistles of S&L trains have been quieted, the busy coal piers dismantled, and no more steel can be exported from Sydney's extinguished mills. But the fisheries, the community's original trade, remain at the heart of the town, and a fortress once destroyed has risen again, at least in part, to share stories of the community's early history with thousands of visitors each year. And at the center but they've also had a significant impact on the experience of those who've lived in the community of Luxburg. As much as the actions of people have shaped the harbor and its role the role it played in these significant conflicts have made its mark on the community's residents, who throughout all 4 wars have demonstrated significant resilience, strength, and a commitment to each other and place that continues to be evident even today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Before I introduce our final presenter, I was just going to ask Chris, do we have a microphone that we can distribute at the end during the question?
Yeah, that's the one I got to.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so now I'll take the time to introduce our final presenter for the first session of our conference. And this, of course, is Ken Donovan, a retired Parks Canada historian who has published extensively on Cape Breton history. His groundbreaking work on the history of Luxburg contributed to a broader understanding of gender and race in the town during the 18th century. And his work on Cape Breton history broadly, including his 2 major edited collections, The Island and Cape Breton at 200, have been foundational for generations of regional scholars. So welcome, Ken. Looking forward to the paper.
Back, or you can use this guy here. It's up to you.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Good. Great to see everybody. And thank you to Lachlan and his committee for organizing this significant conference. My paper is about a Dutch war bride from Amsterdam and Mcginnis. And the paper roughly deals with half of Ella's life in Amsterdam and one half in Mcginnis. And it's a story of struggle in many ways, coming from a working class background in Europe and a working class background in Mcginnis. And lots of suffering, but in spite of it all, Ella persevered. Ella will be 98 on December 12th of this year. And I started this project in 2008, formally interviewing Ella. And she's blessed with a remarkable memory. And I mean remarkable. And she also had the letters that her husband, Alex, wrote to her from Canada and during the war, when he had to go back to England and from Holland. And she also has some remarkable pictures, and I'll be showing you a few of those today. Ella's born in Amsterdam, and her name was Cornelia Aletta Anna Iske. Her dad was, her grandfather was originally of Norwegian descent. Ella had a working class background, as I mentioned, came from a large family, the middle child of 11 children. 2 children had died, and she remembered those deaths and remembered them like they were yesterday. So it's quite remarkable. During the war, Ella's dad was a truck driver, and they would go out. One of his jobs, his company was eventually taken over by the Germans, and he had to go gather dead during the night, especially Air Force, British Air Force people that would be flying over, airmen. But he was never allowed to leave the truck when they picked up the men. The German troops would be in the truck and they would go out and get the bodies. So you can see Ella has remarkable photos of where her grandparents lived. Her dad here shown on the street in about 1909. And her dad died in 1944 when Ella was 17. This is Ella's mom here. Ella went to the 7th grade, and she didn't last at that school very long because she was treated so poorly. Children are very conscious of being mistreated, you know, especially if you come from a working class background, a background where you just don't measure up in terms of style and status. If you don't dress properly, you don't have the same kind of clothes, you don't speak quite the same way. So Ella was taught how to learn to sew and to cook at the school. But she said sometimes they treated us nicely, other times not so. And then at 14, Ella moves from Amsterdam to Hilversum. And the Germans invaded Holland on 10th of May, 1940. Ella was working at the school, and in this school there were 12 children on each side of the school. And Ella was one of 2 young girls, women, who looked after one half of the house. Ella's reaction to the Nazi invasion on 10th of May, 1940. The first morning I got up, and I usually came downstairs and made a pot of porridge. It was only 6 o'clock in the morning, and there were 24 kids in the school. And the supervisor, there was one supervisor who lived next door, a mature woman, and she mentioned that the Germans had invaded the Netherlands. And Ella said, I was scared. It was something I didn't expect. That morning we all got together, and it was the last time we sang the Dutch national anthem. Everyone was crying. And you might say, well, yeah, you know, what's the story on not knowing about the German invasion? Ella was 17, so not a whole lot formally educated, but also the Germans and the Dutch had been always relatively close people. You know, people went on summer holidays to Germany and vice versa, and lots of intermarriage. So they didn't expect the Nazis to invade the way they did. And so you can see Ella at the day school here, they're on a swing, this is 1938 to 40, and Ella's pointed out there, she's not much older than the children that she's looking after. So you had to grow up quickly during this era. And I don't know about many people in this room, but my mom got a grade school education and had to go to work at 14. My dad didn't have much more. He was a World War II veteran, and people had to grow up quickly, especially if you came from the working class. Ella returned to Amsterdam in 1943, and then her dad died in 44, and that was really a crushing blow for the family. Ella begins to work in the post office, and I've got a photo of post ladies here. And this is a picture of Ella herself, smiling, her cap jauntily turned back to one side, but she got the post job because there were no men left. They were all at war, imprisoned. 2 of her brothers, one was shot, another one was imprisoned. There were no men left. They were taken to Germany and forced to work in German factories. I have a picture of Ella and her co-workers after being fired from the hospital for stealing food. And I would just like to read you a bit of this, paint a picture of her life at that time. Working in the hospital. Ella remembered when she started to work there. It was shortly before her dad died on 23rd of February 1944. Ella boarded with a lady called Mrs. Lobes for 5 guilders a month near the hospital. Mrs. Lobes had a sick son. A lady in her 70s, Mrs. Loeb, who had a sick son. The hospital itself was operated by the Dutch, but in a sense it was a microcosm of Dutch society at the time. The German patients were treated much better than the Dutch. Each morning, Ella had to pass a security checkpoint to enter work at 7 a.m. Ella worked in the kitchen, cleaning vegetables, mostly beets. She also cleaned tulip bulbs, a substitute for potatoes. When cooked, Ella thought the bulbs were not bad, but the seeds were bitter. In 1944, Ella recalled that the Germans put us through hell. We saw German boys in the hospital, soldiers, 14, 15, 16, who were wounded. This was an awful time to go through. During the last 2 years of the war, people were starving because there was little or no food available. And after the invasion of Normandy in June 1744, the Allied powers began to gradually degrade the German war machine. But it was a life and death struggle. The Germans in turn made life much more difficult for the Dutch. Because of food shortages, the available food was made available to the German military. In order to survive, Ella had to smuggle food out of the hospital. As Ella explained, sometimes you have to be dishonest. Ella and 3 of her friends who worked with her in the hospital wore skirts, and they made a small square bag that each wore under their skirts so they could hide tulip bulbs, potatoes, beets, small bottles of yogurt, and other scraps of food. Ella smuggled food to her mother, her 2 younger siblings, and her grandmother. She also helped Mrs. Lobes, who had that sick son. So it was a struggle, and you can see the amazing photos that Ella has besides her amazing memory. But you can see here they have a bit of a smile coming when they were fired. And it was a portent of the better times to come. Ella met Alex Barron from Mcginnis in October 1945, and they were married in Holland on 24th of January 1946. Ella comes to Halifax on the Queen Mary, and she makes her way to North Sydney and then eventually on to Mcginnis. A big part of her life in Mcginnis was trying to cope with village life. She was a young city woman, and it wasn't easy. And if you read about Dutch war brides, and there were some 42,000 in Canada from 1946 to 52, thereabouts. And there was another million in the United States. So Ella's experience is just one person's lens on what's happening during this war, during this era. Alex had been previously married, and his wife had died. He had 3 young daughters, yet he was drafted to go to war, as was my dad. People remembered the experience of the First World War, and they weren't all clamoring to sign up because they knew the death rates. Believe me, they knew them. This is Alec and Ella's house in Mcginnis. Mcginnis shortly after Ella's arrival. Alex, he was a big, able guy, and he was part of an anti-tank regiment. And I can't imagine anything more difficult. The airborne regiment probably would have been even worse, but the Germans had these fierce war machines, Panzer and Tiger tanks. The Sherman tank pound for pound, couldn't match them, couldn't even pierce their armor. So Alex is in this, because he's big and strong, and got many pictures of his regiment. Here's a more detailed photo here, and Alex is down in front, second from the left. See a little girl in the background there. This is someplace in Holland or France, not sure. But Alex went through tremendous suffering because of the war. And I'm just going to read you a little bit about that. And because of the Canadians who fought in Afghanistan, we're well aware of PTSD and what it means. But during the Second World War, when people came home, they didn't have the same sense of awareness of that. One soothing comfort was going to the Legion with your buddies, and my dad did a lot of that, but it fit in with what was happening in post-war Canada. So I set the context for Mcginnis, much like Amsterdam, and so I'm just going to read you just briefly a bit about conclusion. Ella's strong character, her sense of purpose, the hardships she endured during the war, and the passage of time helped to protect her from the intolerance she faced as an immigrant. And she was Dutch, didn't speak very good English. She was a Protestant. She started studying to be a Catholic, but Alex was always writing to her and saying, please, Ella, you know how important it is that you become a Catholic. It's very important to me and my family and my people. He continually writes this. Ella had a voice and she was determined to be heard. Over the past 50 years, I have interviewed more than 150 people from Mcginnis, preserved as digital audio recordings at Cape Breton University. And she was among the most determined people to tell her story. She had lived through 5 years of Nazi occupation, and Ella recalled, it took people here a long time to realize what I went through. Ella eventually became a full-fledged Catholic. She became a member of the community. But just to give you one example, her third baby died, baby Aletta. She was born on 4th of November 1948 at Buchanan Memorial Hospital in Niels Harbor. The baby was sick, but Ella stated, nobody would help me. I got the blame. I couldn't get anybody to take her to the hospital. The women of the village rallied around Ella, at least in spirit, providing empathy and emotional support, especially those who had experienced miscarriages. Ella stood up for and protected her children when they faced discrimination because of their Dutch ancestry. This was ironic because the Dutch were favored officially by Canadian immigration policy, while other groups of immigrants were excluded. I felt sorry for the children in the community, her children. It took a long time here to realize what I went through. It was harder on the kids. They used to be beaten. They couldn't go outside, Betty and Alex especially. For Ella, the hardest things was seeing the kids suffer. But eventually, Ella perseveres, and she talks a lot about Alex waking up during the night, screaming, sweating, banging at her in his sleep, having nightmares. And, the smell of cordite going up against these huge tanks, the explosions, all of this stuff that little of us know about. But she was there to comfort her husband. But in spite of all the suffering, the woman persevered. She'll be 98 on 12th of December. And I hope this paper is seen as a celebration of her life. And I hope it's going to be published, but I just hope she lives long enough to see it. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks so much, Ken. And thank you to all of our presenters in our first session. So now we have about 20 minutes for questions. So what I might do is bring some chairs up here so that our presenters could come and sit, and perhaps we could use the microphone, I guess, here to take around to the tables to ask any questions. And then each presenter could come up to this microphone to deliver their response, if that would work. All right, excuse me for a moment as I get the chairs kind of sorted out. Okay, so could I ask our presenters to come sit up in the front so that they have easy access to the microphones to respond to the questions? Chris, I don't know who wants to walk around with the microphone, maybe one of the students? Yeah, could you ask maybe Avery out at the,
Sure.
or Scott, maybe Scott will
Scott will
do
do
it.
it. Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, so are there any questions for any of the panelists or for the entire panel as a whole? All right, Jane Arnold has a question over here.
Thanks, all the presentations were wonderful. Just a quick question, Ken. I was wondering if Ella ever did see her mother or siblings again.
Yeah, she went back to Holland twice, the first time in 1977. And she went back because...
Sorry, Ken, could you walk up here to the microphone?
Oh, excuse me, yeah. The question was, had Ella ever seen her mother again?
Yeah, her mother lived to be in her 90s. Lots of longevity, and she went back twice, once in 1977, and a few years later, and again after that. But she only went back after she started working in 1975. So she started working and saving money, and of course her family were getting older by then. I didn't show a picture of her family, but I do have one there. There's her family right there. She had 10 children, and this is a picture of Ella in June 2020, right there.
Any other questions? Yes, Colonel Cotton.
So thanks again for the presentations. I thoroughly enjoyed them. And I don't know if this is best directed towards Mitch or to Dr. Tennyson. I'm curious to know amongst your studies if there was any sort of substantial change to the culture and the dynamic in Cape Breton as a result of the war, either after the World War I or after World War II, similar to what would have happened in Newfoundland as a result of the catastrophic loss of the Blue Puttees, where they had a significant loss of what otherwise would have been leadership in the then colony of Newfoundland. Was there a similar significant change to the dynamic here in Cape Breton following the World Wars as a result of the high casualty rates?
I don't think I really have an answer to that, but I think if somebody did the work, and I'm not sure anybody has done the work, but I think if they did, you would see that there was, because during the war, of course, the Cape Breton was thriving, maybe not so much the agricultural areas, but the industrial. And that all fell apart. Well, maybe that's an overstatement. But they went into crisis in the 20s. The steel plant and the coal mines are all owned by the same company. and all the companies that ran those things all through the history were external companies. And the British Empire Corporation that owned them, I give them a little bit of credit in a way that I think they don't get in Cape Breton. They took a very hard line on productivity and squeezing down wages and whatnot, and have a terrible reputation, deserved, for their treatment of the miners, and there were strikes, and the militia was called in, and so on and so on. On the other hand, the company couldn't survive after 1919, 1920, because the federal government changed all the freight rates, very much to the Maritimes' disadvantage. So their market was primarily in central Canada, but they couldn't compete with steel plants in central Canada or with coal mines in Pennsylvania. The only thing that they had control over essentially was wages. So they were caught in the middle, but it was a period of tremendous stress and unrest. And I suspect that there has to be a connection to some extent to the experience of the war, the men coming home, heroes and all that, and then facing unemployment. And not just in Cape Breton, of course. I just finished a book on Ontario, and the same thing. Everything during the war, governments just tremendously support the war effort and up to the point of conscription. But when the war came to an end and the men came home, governments did they did introduce some programs to try to help the transition and get them. But an awful lot of the veterans didn't think they did very much. And of course they came home to find that women had taken a lot of their jobs, even factory jobs, or even worse, men who had not enlisted, and that included a lot of immigrants, some of whom came from places like Germany or Eastern Europe or whatnot, or Asians, but they enlisted in much smaller numbers. And so you had a terrible outbreaks of, I'm not talking about Cape Breton, I'm talking really about Ontario, but I suspect you'd find that if somebody looked into it. And yet we have the example of Murphy, of course, who moved to the United States. So I think it would be a very interesting study of the 20s to see just how much connection you could make with disillusionment, sense that it hadn't been a noble crusade at all, just a bloody massacre, and then coming back to what? So I can't really answer that because I'm just speculating.
Thanks very much. Any other questions?
Yeah, we got two over here.
Oh.
Hi there. This one's for Sarah, actually. I really enjoyed your talk as a historian based not here. I must admit I tend to associate Fortress Louisbourg with the 18th century and not much else. And so seeing the community of Louisburg tracked into the 20th century conflicts was really quite interesting. And I was wondering if there have been, obviously not on the same scale, but physical legacies of those conflicts that remain in the area around Louisburg today.
That's a great question. So, and it's, like you said, I'm not a 20th century historian, so my focus through my work is always in the 18th century, but within the community itself, there's definitely that recognition of what took place. And for those who are aware, you can find those locations that were impacted and those remnants of what's left. the difficulty is that that story often isn't told. Like you said, when we think of Luxburg, we think of that 18th century history. So going forward, there needs to be a way to incorporate that into our telling of the Luxburg story as a more complete narrative, rather than just the focus on the 18th century. So I don't know if that's a full answer, but it's definitely something that we can aspire to. Yeah. Thank you.
Before you take your seat there, Sarah. Sorry. Really enjoyed your paper as well. My question, perhaps unfairly, is a 20th, 19th century question as well. Okay. But you commented on the role played by Louisbourgians. What are the locals referred to? Yeah. We'll go with that. Could you say anything more about militia participation in either the Nova Scotia militia prior to Confederation or even as late as the Interwarriors? It seems like there is a bit of a martial spirit in the community that certainly came out during the wars, but was there anything that remained or existed prior to or in between those wars?
I have to admit my focus in thinking about this was on both wars, so I'm not exactly sure what that militia activity was like, but certainly within the communities, there was that uptake on both occasions to participate, and not only that, to really foster that community for members of service who may have been coming from other places. So yeah, you definitely have that level, and it's interesting because I mentioned Melville Huntington, who was the mayor during the Second World War, but whose journals start long before that. So you have his experiences as someone who's not in a public service role during the First World War as well, and he kind of outlines that community participation throughout. So Luxburg definitely was cognizant of the role that they played in the war effort, and I think the citizens were happy to step up where they could in order to support that. Thanks.
Hi, I have a question for Brian Tennyson again. You mentioned that Frank Parker Day, the CO of the 185th, I know he wasn't from Cape Breton or really didn't have anything to do with Cape Breton. How did the men feel about his leadership, I guess, from an outsider? I don't know if you've come across anything like that in any papers or any of your research.
The short answer is no, but Frank Parker Day, I've developed a considerable interest in him for a number of reasons. Well, he's just a very interesting man. He spent his life as a university English professor and administrator in the United States. And but he had a summer place in Yarmouth County because he married a Yarmouth girl whose name happened to be Killam. You may be familiar with the Killams. Dalhousie Library is named after the Killams, and the very, very wealthy family. He married one of them. So they had a rustic cottage, and near Yarmouth. So he spent summers there and then retired there. But he was a writer. He wrote, you may be familiar with the novel Rockbound. They had a big resurgence about 20 years ago, rediscovery, and it's still in print and whatnot. Supremely disturbed people who live on Rockbound, which is actually Ironbound, in Lunenburg County, because they thought he was making fun of them. I don't think he was, from what I know of him. He was one of the writers who was very much part of the movement in the late 19th century and early 20th century of rediscovering folk life and folk culture, and he appreciated that. He was very much appreciated. And some people, notably one historian who's wrote a book sneering at, not at Parker Day, but this whole thing of rural, traditional, non-technology, non-big city values, saying, oh, it was just a ploy to stimulate the tourist industry. I don't agree with that. The government did exploit it, but they didn't create it. Anyway, he wrote a delightful memoir. And his papers, I'm recently discovered, are actually in the Dalhousie archives. So because of the COVID, I couldn't get at them, but I think I can now. So I don't have any information on what the men of the 185th thought about him. My impression is, and it's pretty slight because he wasn't involved with them very long, is that the men of the 25th liked him and respected him. He was a gentle giant. He was a big guy, very gentle, very thoughtful. In his own memoirs, he has one chapter on the First World War, his experience in the First World War. And he says virtually nothing really about the war. He talks about places and relationships with men and trying to shoot down a German plane with a rifle, unsuccessfully, of course. I think my sense is that even though he was not there very long, that they respected him and liked him, and he maintained in his later life, I've seen some of his correspondence, people kept in touch. And he was a guy who his whole life kept in touch with people. That's how he got, I think, to be the colonel of the battalion in the first place. He was born and went way back to their teenage years, and he kept in touch. But there's nothing that I'm aware of. Now, if we had letters from veterans, but they only would have known him, you see, when they were in Broughton, but not that much, because the first several months he was with another guy, Jim Madden, who they toured the island recruiting, and it was really Gordon Harrington who ran things at Broughton until the late spring, early summer. But I haven't seen any of that kind of correspondence. I think it'd be lovely if somebody has it. But and then over in England, I mean, nothing was really going on. But I would speculate that the men liked him because he wasn't pompous. He didn't think he was a big shot because he wasn't that kind of guy. He was a guy who loved to fish and hunt and be one of the boys, and in his later years, that's all he did was, well, he wrote, did a lot of writing, but he liked to get together with guys who were veterans like himself, or Aboriginal. There was an Aboriginal man who was like a guide, and they had very, very close, personal, almost profound relationships. That's kind of the guy. That's what makes him so interesting, and I'm hoping to learn more about him. So I'm only speculating, really. But,
all right, we might have time for one last question, and we can come over here.
Thanks. One more question for Sarah. And again, I apologize because this may not be in the time frame of your expertise and your preferred questions. You mentioned that at one point an additional Highland battalion was stood up to defend the town and the harbor in Luxburg. And I was wondering if there were any, or if you were aware of any additional history of that battalion, if it's something that actually lasted beyond the war, disappeared when its time was over, the need was no longer there, or integrated into returning battalions.
Yeah, so are you speaking to the First World War when
Yes.
the Argyle, yeah. So the Argyle Highlanders were brought in order to defend the Marconi Station, and then during that wartime, that Marconi Station's decommissioned. So you see that group of men disbanded. So it's about 80 individuals, I believe, who were there that whole time. I'm not sure where they went after that point. I do know they were sorely missed within the community, particularly in the hockey league. So that's a nice thing at least. But yes, they definitely played a really important role in the community while they were there and in that protection.
Thank you.
Oh.
I might be able to help a little bit on that. The 94th Argyle Highlanders were, of course, the Militia Regiment, and when the war broke out, they were called out and put used for coastal defense, and they were the ones that were sent to Luxburg. And there's one man whose name I've forgotten offhand, but who was interviewed as many years later in Cape Breton's magazine. He lived in Bedeck and talked about, as a young man working on the farm and being called out and going down and doing that. I actually talk about that a little bit in my book on military history of Sydney Harbor, which is a bizarre subject for a book, but anyway. So the 94th was the basic group around which the 25th Battalion was created. Not that everybody came from the 94th, but it supplied a lot of the men came from Cape Breton. Over something like 60% of the men, the first 1,000, in the 25th Battalion came from Cape Breton, and most of them were Gaelic speakers. And initially, it was just coastal defense, and then they created the overseas battalion and so on. And coastal defense it may sound funny to us today, guarding Halifax Harbor and Sydney Harbor and whatever, and the undersea cable stations in North Sydney and what's the one down near Cancel? And so a lot of them never got overseas, but a lot of them did, because first they thought they had an important job, but then after a year and a half sitting there doing nothing, some of them probably thought, real lucky, this is good. But a lot of them didn't. They thought, no, I signed up to actually go contribute. But Luxburg remained a defended harbor through the war for good reasons. I don't know if that's helpful.
Well, thanks to everybody from our first session. I'd like to thank them all again. And now we have our break, so please enjoy some of the coffee and tea and some of the snacks, and we'll return in 15 minutes for our first keynote. All right, thank you everybody. I hope you enjoyed your break. And now, of course, we're happy to welcome the first keynote speaker of our conference. You'll see on the screen, this is Paul Thompson joining us from Charlottetown. He is the Director General of Commemoration Division with Veterans Affairs Canada. Mr. Thompson joined Veterans Affairs Canada in 2013 and has worked in various areas of the department, including communications and service delivery divisions. He became Director General of Commemoration Division in 2019. He is based out of Veterans Affairs Canada's head office in Charlottetown, and prior to joining VAC, he worked in the municipal government and not-for-profit and private sectors. In his role as DG Commemoration, he has overseen a team of professionals at VAC who are committed to honoring the service and sacrifice of Canadian veterans. He has led commemorative events, including the 75th anniversary of D-Day and the Battle of Normandy, the 75th anniversary of the Italian campaign, significant Korean War milestones, the Battle of the Somme and Beaumont Hamel, National Peacekeepers Day and VJ Day, and the Second World War. His team oversees the maintenance and operations of 14 memorials in Europe, including the Canadian National Vimy Memorial and the Beaumont Hamel Newfoundland Memorial sites. In Canada, the commemoration team operates and maintains 2 veteran cemeteries, and they are Fort Massey in Halifax and Veterans Cemetery God's Acre in Eskimo, British Columbia. In addition, among other things, his team develops educational materials for teachers, manages a community engagement and memorial funding program, and works with contractors to ensure that our veteran grave markers, both overseas as well as in Canada, remain well maintained. Mr. Thompson has a master's in public administration from Dalhousie University and an honors degree in political science and French from Carleton University. So please welcome Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Lachlan. And I hope you can hear me. If you can't, if you can give me a thumbs up. So I'm
sorted out, Mr. Thompson.
Okay.
Can you check the audio, please? Okay.
Check.
Oh, perfect. Yep, so you can go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Lachlan, for the kind words of introduction. Good morning and greetings, CBU President Dingwall, distinguished presenters and guests. Again, sorry that I can't be with you today in person. Unfortunately, as is the case for a lot of us, I remain in my home office in Charlottetown. As such, let me begin by acknowledging that I am speaking to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Abbotsford First Nation. And I do want to say again that I'm honored, privileged to join you as the Veterans Affairs Canada representative for this conference on Canada's military and social history. Cape Breton itself owns a small part of that history, with the well-known Cape Breton Highlanders headquartered just a few minutes down the road from where you are at the university. What started in 1871 as the Victoria Provisional Battalion of Infantry has gone on to establish for itself a long and distinguished history of courage. Members of the Highlanders would forge their reputation through active service in the First and Second World Wars and an ongoing dedication to the pursuit and protection of peace and freedom in the world ever since. As Director General of Commemoration at Veterans Affairs, I have to share the story that our main head office building in Charlottetown is named after a one-time Highlander, PEI native Daniel J. MacDonald. Despite losing his left arm to a German shell during the Second World War, Sergeant MacDonald came home and went on to become a successful farmer, family man, and provincial and federal politician, including a stint as the Minister of Veterans Affairs in the late 70s and early 80s. That he overcame such grievous wounds is a real testament to the man himself, but also a testament to the resilience instilled in him as a member of the Highlanders. With yesterday, September 30th, being the first annual National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, what better time to mention that the First Nations people of Cape Breton also have a strong tradition of serving Canada in uniform, building on their culture's own long and proud warrior traditions. Many Cape Breton Indigenous people have bravely taken part in Canada's military efforts over the years, from the First World War to today, and we thank them for their great service and sacrifice, as we do the thousands of other Cape Bretoners who have enlisted in the Canadian Army, Navy, and Air Force over the years. The bond between Cape Breton and our military is even evident here at the university. The Memorandum of Understanding signed between CBU and the Department of National Defense in October of 2019 connects Cape Breton's proud military history with today's generation of soldiers and combines the important work of those who serve our country with the opportunity to pursue post-secondary studies. It's a real win-win. Now, in terms of Canadian military history writ large, let me just start by saying something that I'm sure you already know, that for more than 120 years, Canadians have been serving in large numbers, putting their lives on the line in wars and peace support efforts all over the world. But if we wanted to, quote, start at the beginning, we could trace the origins of our country's tradition of large-scale international military service and sacrifice to the South African War, fought between 1899 and 1902. At Britain's request, members of the Commonwealth were called on to contribute to the war effort, with more than 7,000 Canadians, including female nursing sisters, volunteering for service during that conflict. All across Canada, trains loaded with volunteers, and often their horses too, were greeted with thunderous welcomes at every station as they made their way east. Many would end up here in Nova Scotia, where they would set sail from Halifax to South Africa. Even back then, Canadians had a deep appreciation for anyone willing to risk their life in combat, as we still do today. About 280 Canadians were lost during the South African War, but the skill, courage, and sacrifice demonstrated by these soldiers and the rest of their comrades so long ago remains to this day a cornerstone of Canada's military history. Less than 15 years later, Canadians and Newfoundlanders would again be adding to this legacy of service during the First World War, when more than 650,000 of our citizens would serve in uniform, from a population at the time of only about 8 million. Through each battle, a remarkable reputation was formed, with Canadian Corps becoming known for carrying out hard tasks and fulfilling their objectives. By the end of the war, if the Germans learned that Canadians were in the opposing line, they knew they were about to be attacked. So powerful was the reputation our troops had gained. History tells us that it was thanks in large part to the enormous sacrifices made by our service members during the First World War that Canada truly came to be seen as a separate nation in its own right. And that the courageous men who stood fast at Ypres, stormed Regina Trench, climbed the heights of Vimy Ridge, captured Passchendaele, and entered Mons on November 11th, 1918, helped forge our national identity. Their accomplishments are why, even today, many of our battles still echo in our collective memory, like the battles of the Somme and Beaumont-Hamel that raged in the summer of 1916, and whose 105th anniversary we marked not long ago. This tradition of service would rise to the forefront again during the Second World War of 1939 to 45. More than 1 million Canadians would follow in the brave footsteps of the previous generation and see action on the battlefronts around the world, from Hong Kong to France, Italy to Burma, the Atlantic Ocean to the Netherlands. 2021, in fact, marks 80 years since the defense of Hong Kong, where almost 2,000 of our soldiers saw the first sustained action of the Canadian Army during the Second World War. For a country of only 11 million people by then, Canada's contributions were remarkable. And Sydney, Nova Scotia was an essential port during the conflict, with convoys assembling in the harbour and the coal and steel produced in Sydney helping the Allied war effort. The sinking of the Ss Caribou as it sailed from North Sydney to Port aux Basques in October 1942 is a stark reminder that the perils of war struck close to the home for people on Cape Breton. Our troops fought in places like Dieppe, Normandy, Ortona, the Scheldt, and Rhineland. And they were instrumental in liberating the Netherlands, an accomplishment for which the Dutch still remember us very warmly today. By the time that peace was won, Canada had become a significant military power with one of the world's largest navies, the fourth largest air force, and what some came to call the best little army in the world. On the shoulders of our Second World War veterans and fallen stand those who so valiantly served in the defense of peace and democracy in Korea. On harsh and unforgiving terrain, our armed forces took the fight to a fiercely determined enemy. Earlier this year, we marked the 70th anniversary of perhaps Canada's single most important action of that entire conflict, the Battle of Capcom in April 1951. In the face of great challenges, the 2nd Battalion of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry helped prevent a potentially costly defeat for the South Korean and United Nations forces. The outcome would have easily been different had it not been for the brave Canadians who held off a force several times their own size. The war would return peace to the people of South Korea. And the modern, prosperous East Asian country that exists there now was only made possible through the courage and sacrifice of the brave UN troops that included our Canadians. More than 26,000 of them would serve in the Korean War. 516 lost their lives. They all did us proud. The spirit and tradition of service displayed by these troops has continually evolved, often in important new ways. This fall marks the 65th anniversary of the first large-scale United Nations peacekeeping mission, one in which Canada played a seminal role. The Suez Crisis of 1956 threatened to draw the world once more into war. It was Canada's then Secretary of State for External Affairs, Lester B. Pearson, who suggested that an armed UN peacekeeping force be sent to Egypt to oversee the withdrawal of foreign troops and monitor the tense situation. Canadian soldiers would be part of this multinational coalition that established a blueprint for a new form of international service that would see Canada take part in dozens of peace support operations in the decades that follow. The list is familiar to many of us: Cyprus, the Balkans, Rwanda, Haiti, Cambodia, East Timor, Mali, and so many others. More than 125,000 Canadians have served in these and other peacekeeping operations over the years, helping to restore and maintain peace and security in areas devastated by conflict. Over 130 of them have given their lives in the service of this mission. But peacekeeping is not the only way that our modern era service people have contributed to peace and security around the world. During the Cold War, they served at home, in Europe, and on the Atlantic Ocean as part of the NATO forces that helped to defend the free countries of the West from the threat of the Soviet Union and its communist allies. Just over 30 years ago, more than 4,000 CAF personnel served in the Middle East during the Gulf War, flying missions in dangerous skies, patrolling the risky waters of the Persian Gulf, staffing a field hospital, and supporting the military efforts in other ways from bases in Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And of course, just a few weeks ago, we marked the 20th anniversary of 9/11 and the start of the long campaign against international terrorism that was born out of that terrible day. More than 40,000 Canadians served in Afghanistan. It's theater of operations between 2001 and the close of our military mission there in 2014. While our troops were there, they helped push the Taliban from power and improved life for Afghans. But the effort to reduce the threat of international terrorism, the international terrorist attacks, and helping rebuild the country cost the lives of 158 CAF members and 7 civilians. For many Afghanistan veterans, watching the country's recent fall to the Taliban has stirred strong emotions: anger, frustration, sadness. A reminder to all of us that even years after our service people leave a conflict, the conflict never really leaves them. They all gave and did so much in the service of a difficult and very demanding mission. It's a testament to them and their professionalism that they still feel so strongly about what happens in a country they left so long ago. They care about the places they deployed to and the people they were sent to protect. And that's as true of our Afghanistan veterans as it is of the brave Canadians who served in the Gulf War, the Korean War, and the First and Second World Wars. It's as true of the veterans who risked their lives in so many peace, support, and humanitarian operations all over the world. And of those who have distinguished themselves on domestic missions, helping Canadian communities recover from floods, ice storms, and wildfires, and even the COVID-19 pandemic. It doesn't matter where they've been or what work they've done. If they've gone to war or never left the Canadian military base, they have all served us proudly. And all of them deserve to be honored in the same breath as those who participated in the more traditional military engagements that we tend to highlight and commemorate. This line of thinking is driving a shift at Veterans Affairs Canada towards a new form of commemoration that focuses more closely on the experiences and contributions of our modern day veterans. Of course, we will always remember those who fought in the trenches, who liberated Europe, and who served in East Asia, and will always uphold our sacred duties to preserve our memories around the world and to care for the graves and cemeteries that hold Canada's fallen. Their stories will continue to be told, and we at Veterans Affairs will keep commemorating the remarkable efforts that literally helped save our country and the world from those who wanted so badly to take our peace and freedom away. At the same time, we have to think about our modern day veterans and what their military service means to us. Most of the nearly 630,000 veterans alive in Canada today were born after the Second World War. They are remarkable Canadians with remarkable legacies of service, peoples whose stories deserve to be told. It's why Veterans Affairs has made this conscious choice to start focusing more on their military contributions. We've been consulting with former and current Canadian Armed Forces personnel, RCMP members with international policing experience and their families about how we should recognize and remember all those who have served. Maybe some of you here today even have ideas about that. We want you to tell us how you think we can pay tribute to the hundreds and thousands who've worn the uniform since the Second World War and the war in Korea on operations abroad and right here at home, including the many Nova Scotians who have served in all sorts of military efforts over the years. Our veterans all have in common the distinction of having worn a uniform for their country, and all deserve to know that we are grateful for them for their service. Many of the freedoms we have today in Canada we owe to the brave Canadians who had the courage to enlist, from modern-day CAF personnel going all the way back to those who served in South Africa at the dawn of the 20th century. Our service people have helped to build this country into what it is today, a peace-building nation that values the ideals of freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. We can never forget the enormous toll this important work has taken on so many individual Canadians, nor must we ever stop talking about what they accomplished with that red maple leaf on their shoulder. Regardless of how long they served, what rank they reached, or where their service took them. We are forever in their debt and forever grateful to them for what they've done for us. And it's our job at Veterans Affairs Canada and other stakeholders and organizations to make them always know it. We want them to always know it. Thank you. Again, thank you for allowing me to present at the conference today, and thank you very much.
Mr. Thompson, thank you on behalf of myself, as well as Cape Breton University as a whole and all of the participants of our conference. We very much appreciate all of your comments today, and we very much appreciate you joining us as a representative of Veterans Affairs Canada. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day and the conference.
All right, everybody. If we could very somewhat quickly make our way down to the board more, we'll be there to attend the presentation of honorary degrees.